Hey, welcome back to E-commerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcify. I'm your host, Nathan Resnick, joined by my co-host, Aaron Alpeter. Aaron, today we've got a pretty unique episode because this is our category kickoff. Usually on E-commerce on Tap, we break things up by seasons. Last season, we did athleisure, which I think my favorite was Gymshark. I just loved that episode. And for those joining us for the first time on E-commerce on Tap, do you want to give a brief overview on what we do?
Yeah, basically what we do, and now in seasons we pick a category, but we usually take a well-known, typically venture-backed company, tell their founding story, reverse engineer their supply chain, and then talk about their X potential.
So this season we're covering skincare, which is pretty fascinating because number one, it's changed so much over time in terms of what skincare is. Number two, there's been some major exits that we're going to cover. I think we all have seen that Hailey Bieber Roan exit, which was just incredible to see. 3 years and $1 billion, just an incredible outcome. But there's a lot of other amazing outcomes in this skincare category that we're going to go over and walk through everything from their supply chain to growth story to exit strategy and where they're at. Today, we're doing a deep dive on skincare in particular. So if you've ever been interested in starting a skincare brand, understanding the market dynamics, understanding the major players in the market and how these products are sourced, you're going to want to tune in. But before we dive in, I've got one key ask of all of our listeners. If you haven't already, you need to subscribe to E-commerce on Tap and leave us a review. So Aaron and I greatly appreciate you taking a second out of your day to do that. And now let's dive in.
Yeah, Nathan, quick question to get us started. What's the largest organ in your body?
Um, I mean, that is a good question. I feel like I would say like I don't know, my liver or something like that, but I have a feeling it's different.
Nope, it is your skin. So your skin is actually an organ, and on the average adult, it covers about 20 square feet and weighs more than your femurs. Here's the kicker. You shed about 30,000 dead skin cells every single minute. And so literally you're leaving a trail of yourself wherever you go.
That is crazy. And if that makes you want to exfoliate, you're in good company because today we're talking all about skin, not just products or routines, but the full story, the history, the culture, the science, and the multi-billion-dollar industry that this has become.
Yeah, we're going to go from Cleopatra's milk baths to TikTok's 10-step routines, from rice water in ancient China to peptide serums in Beverly Hills. Skincare has really always been something that's more than just appearance. It's medicine, it's marketing, it's ritual, it's rebellion in some cases.
Aaron, do you have a skincare routine?
Actually, I do. I just recently, but I don't know the products, but I use a cleanser at night to kind of wash my face off because my wife told me I'm looking old, and then I put lotion on. What about
There
you?
we go. Well, I think your skin is glowing, so you're doing something right.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, my girlfriend is super into skincare and kind of loves all these different things, whether it be, the TikToks or who knows where else she sees some of this stuff. But, she has gotten me like basically a lotion I put on my face, usually at night and in the mornings. And it actually, it does feel pretty good. So I'm not against it, honestly.
Yeah. Well, before we dive into the history and everything with skincare, was there anything that stuck out to you this past week?
Yeah, I have been keeping some tabs on just publicly traded e-commerce brands. Obviously we saw kind of that Solo Stove or a kayak brand and roll up just get decimated in the public markets. I mean, that was just kind of crazy to see. On the flip side, Canada Goose, so where you're up in Canada, Aaron, did you notice the stock was up 50% last month? I was
I
like,
did
wow,
not. I
what
did
is going
not.
on? Especially
I know
because
somebody who runs the supply chain there. I got to text them and tell them congrats.
yeah, well, they're doing well. And so, the revenue is up. They're doing about 385 million Canadian dollars, and the adjusted EBITDA is up about 49% to $60 million. D2C sales is up 16%. And it just seems like they're operating very efficiently. And even better, they weren't affected at all by these tariffs. 75% of their products are made in Canada, which was
Wow.
surprising to me. I did not realize that. And so, the company as well is actually holding off full year guidance, which is, very unusual as a publicly traded company. But just due to the macro volatility in the market. So, I mean, pretty incredible to see. They've got a market cap of about 1.7 billion Canadian dollars. And I just was surprised that that Goose is up. That's a good ticker to check out.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't know why, but I guess I'm surprised that Canada Goose is made in Canada. It makes sense, right? Like it should be here. But I just assumed it was going to be Vietnam or China or something. So good for them,
Yeah, I guess they've probably been just making it there for a while, right?
for sure. Yeah, so for me, this is a couple weeks old, but I kind of was digging into the deal. GCL, which is Global Critical Logistics, was acquired by a PE company for over $1 billion. They were PE owned before and they sold to another PE company. But this is a logistics company that really built this niche around equipment for live events. So think like Taylor Swift's Era Tour, Beyonce's tour, World Cup, NFL. Those are the sorts of things that this company moves and does. And what was really interesting to me was the multiple. And so again, private company, not publicly available, but the estimates I could find was that their revenue was between 250 to $300 million, and they sold for $1 billion. And you look at that, you're like, okay, yeah, 3-4x is not a terrible multiple. But then compare that with JB Hunt, and they have a market cap of $14 billion with revenue of $12 billion. And so it's just really interesting how if you are hyper focused and you carve out this niche that you really own, and that niche happens to be a tailwind where people are doing more and more in-person events, just the multiples can be really, really interesting there. So that was what stuck out to me.
Yeah, I think it was just maybe that PE fund wanted to get in closer with the Swifties, the Taylor Swift fans. But that is a surprising multiple for a logistics company of that nature.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because they sold after the Eras tour, and I know that was a big deal and a lot of stuff going on. I don't know to what extent the future looks like it, so it could be that they're selling at the apex of kind of this cycle, but or maybe just the new owners wanted some Eras tour tickets.
Yeah, it's a good point. Well, let's dive into the history of skincare in terms of probably in ancient civilization they viewed their skin routine and skincare routine a lot different than we do today. I would imagine.
You're absolutely right, and I think what's really interesting about this is that there have been a couple of distinct phases of how people approach skincare, and that's reflective of the culture. It's reflective of beauty standards and things like that. And what's interesting is a lot of these things that people have done since ancient times, we're still doing today. And so if you go back to kind of antiquities, I think ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome, this was really skincare as status and ritual. And so there was a lot of use of like castor oil, sesame oils, clay masks that thought was there to protect you from dry air and the sun. And really, especially in Egypt, skin was tied to both beauty and spiritual purity. And so Cleopatra reportedly bathed in milk for the lactic acid. And you saw a lot of ingredients like honey, frankincense, aloe vera, many of which are still used today. In Greece and Rome, there was a lot of focus on the bathhouse culture. And so they would use things like olive oil or herbal infusions, to sometimes wine, to help with toner or things like that. China and Japan, there was focus on really making sure that your skincare was linked to refinement and spiritual harmony. So geishas in Japan would use rice brands or camellia oil. In China, they used jade rollers or rice water. And smooth skin was really what they were going for. And in India, it's really about kind of this skin as a reflection of your inner health. And so ancient skincare really emphasized spiritual purity, inner balance, self-respect. And it wasn't about flaw correction, which I think is a really big difference from today. And so much of the skincare today is marketed toward a lens of insecurity, right? I need to fix my acne. I need to fix my wrinkles. I don't like this blotch on my skin. And so I guess for you, as I kind of reflect on this, what does it say to us where about kind of our culture today that Cleopatra used to use skincare to feel divine, and people are often using it today to try to feel acceptable?
Yeah, I think it revolves around kind of the outside image that is portrayed upon ourselves, right? Whether it be looking in the mirror every morning and every night that they probably didn't do in, these ancient civilizations, or comparing themselves to other people around the world, right? I think what's really standing out to me as you look at the history of skincare is that it is very siloed based on where you are from, right? What skincare is considered in Japan is totally different than what the Romans and Greeks considered as great beautiful skin, and the way they went about achieving those results through different ways of taking care of themselves was so different around the world at that time. Whereas in today's world, we're exposed to what people are doing in Korea for their skincare routine, or what people are doing in, wherever it may be around the world. You can pull up social media or, chat GPT and quickly find out, what someone's morning skincare routine is based on where they're at in the world. And I think it still is different in terms of, what does beauty look like to someone in Brazil versus, China is probably different in terms of, how they want to take care of their skin. But at the end of the day, it's, I think really just been changing so much. And we have so much more global exposure to what skincare really is.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of anthropologists point back to medieval times, or the Enlightenment period, as really this shift between skincare as a spiritual or self-care sort of routine to more of social signaling. And so in medieval Europe, so I think 500 to 1500 AD, there was less of an emphasis on hygiene. Being clean was, I guess, seen as vanity or sin. But noble women used to use egg whites to tighten their skin, or vinegar to lighten the skin. And so pale skin was less about health and more about proving that you didn't work outdoors. And so skincare became a performance, a status symbol. And, pale skin was equated with nobility, tan skin was associated with labor. And so you talk about, wanting to get a tan, people would have said, no, I don't want that. I want to stay inside. I want to be as white as possible. In the Renaissance era, people took this to an even further extreme, where they started using lead-based white makeup to become fashionable. And so you think about the old-timey pictures of just the white faces, that was lead. And as you know, lead is incredibly toxic, and it just, people went to these extremes for this idea of social belonging, not just wellness. You started to see the beginning of some cold creams like beeswax and rosewater that was gaining traction among some elites. But then you get to the 1700s, 1800s, this is industrial era, and you start to see this scientific awakening. People recognize that, hey, maybe we shouldn't put lead on our bodies or anywhere near our bodies. And chemistry started to improve some of these formulations. Soap became widely available. And so you think about that, like, people didn't have access to soap. This was now available on a commercial scale. And you start to see brands like Pond's, which was started in 1846, or Vaseline, starting in the 1870s, that became early mass market players.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy to see how skincare has shifted over time. And it's kind of crazy to think that people used to basically poison themselves to try to make themselves look better. I can only imagine what it felt like putting, a lead based white makeup on your face. And it's just crazy even today, that the extent that some people go to, try to make themselves look in a certain way, in an image. And I think, my takeaway is that shift that you really mentioned, in terms of people shifting from more of a, self-care, hey, I want to take care of my body and do this more in a spiritual way, versus, hey, this is social signaling. And
Mhm.
it's interesting that shift happened so long ago.
Well, yeah, it just accelerated in the 20th century. And so this is really where we see the birth of what I would consider modern skincare. And it introduced anti-aging as a category, which was framed as a problem that needed to be solved. So no longer was it acceptable just to have wrinkles. That wasn't just something that happens. Like, no, you're going to fight biology. You're going to fight these things, and you want to look like you're, 25 forever. And so skincare started to change when brands started to promise reversal and correction against, time, right? So it wasn't just about taking care of yourself today; it was about going back in time. Was where it was. In the early 1900s, skincare and cosmetics were kind of blended rituals. So cold creams, we talked about lead-based face paint, herbal masks. They were all considered beauty. But starting in the early 1900s, you have brands like Nivea in 1911, Elizabeth Arden 1910, Helena Rubinstein began to market skincare to the middle class, and so this is where they really became mass. Dermatology as a practice was recognized by the U.S. Medical Board in 1932. You get to the 1950s, 1970s, skincare really evolved as a health-focused practice, and this is where you start to see some of these new ingredients that you hear about: retinoids, AHAs, UV, oil of Olay, Estee Lauder. They introduced this anti-aging category, and this is where business really starts to boom. Move forward to the 1980s, 1990s, and people start to blur this idea of treatment and aspiration. And so there's this new class of products that comes out called cosmeceuticals. And so the idea here is that you're able to take in these cosmetic and therapeutic ingredients and make something that's new. You see dermatologist-backed brands like Neutrogena, which was bought by J&J. As I think about this, I'm wondering, like, okay, did skincare democratize beauty, or did it just give somebody more things to worry about? We got SPF, we got retinol, we got glycic acid. And so I'm just wondering that, did we also kind of intentionally hurt the perception of people where it's like, I'm only as valuable as how my skin looks?
Right. I think that's a key question here because, I mean, number one, today we have so much more to compare ourselves to, which is, in my opinion, not a good thing, fueled through social media and just the amount of mirrors that most people have in their house and all of that. I think number two, like you said and mentioned, there's so many different verticals of skincare now, whether it be, UV protection or hydration or exfoliation type of skincare. I mean, there's just so many different angles when it comes to skincare, and I definitely think some people go above and beyond, and some people that don't take care of their skin at all. And sometimes you meet these people and their skin looks the same, right? And sometimes it's widely different, right? I think it really depends. At the end of the day, I think skincare today is, there's just so many verticals and so many different angles, and sometimes you have to ask, is this made up, or is there real science behind this? And some of these brands do have real science behind them, as we'll dive into.
Yeah, and I think that's a good segue into kind of where we are today as a skincare market. And it's really defined by aspirational marketing. You too can look this way, as well as algorithmic pressure. We've got a lot of stuff that's forcing things to people. And so there's a couple major shifts. The first one is that there is this marriage between science and consumer demand. And so there's a lot of ingredient transparency that people are asking for. Brands like The Ordinary have made good claims about this. You've got dermatologist-led advice, so Dr. Shaw, all over social media. These are all kind of geared toward the promise of empowering consumers, but you can also overwhelm them with too much choice and information. And so you look at social media and influencers. Skincare routines go viral. New brands like Rhode, Summer Fridays, Topicals, all built communities first and then launch product lines behind them. You've got dermatologists like Dr. Shaw, where they are shaping the product lines and they're basically educating the masses. And people say, oh, well, Dr. Shaw did this, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. You've got this movement toward clean beauty. So brands like Drunk Elephant are positioning themselves against parabens and sulfates and toxins, these kind of made up scary scientific things, even though the evidence is somewhat mixed that these are actually worse for you. But this question of like, okay, is this real? Is it misinformation? Is it fear-based? What's going on? SPF is really coming back right now. So brands like Vacation and Ultraviolet are starting to rebrand sunscreen as a fun thing, not just a functional thing. And I guess the last big thread is personalization. You've got a lot of people doing quizzes and bringing data into algorithms, say, here's exactly what you need. And so, to sum up kind of, the four main parts of the market today is social media and influencers, clean beauty, the SPF renaissance, and then this personalization piece. And I just thought, as I was diving into this history, it was really interesting to me how in ancient times, this was all about ritual. In medieval Europe, it was about status. And in the 20th century, it was kind of a race against time. And now in the 2000s, it's this mosaic of personalization, pressure, empowerment, performance, everything living on your face. And so I think it's just so interesting how skincare can change and has changed and will continue to change based on what a society is finding important at that moment in time.
Yeah, I think that's a really good analysis, and I appreciate you going over the history because it is so interesting to see how skincare has changed over time and how different areas of skincare have become more popular over time versus faded in popularity. And I think what's unique is that skincare is ever evolving, right? I mean, dermatologists today are discovering more and more new avenues of skincare, some science based, like biotech formulations that include peptides and different growth factors and bioidentical compounds. And there's microbiome science now that's understanding how skin bacteria can impact barrier health and inflammation. There's AI diagnostics across skincare, which is pretty cool, that really emphasizes personalized treatments, and then different types of delivery systems like nano carriers and time released activities that, has kind of created this innovation around skincare. And you see a lot of new brands leaning into some of these different new advances in science. So I think, 50% is applied science and 50% is kind of translational innovation in terms of adapting pharmaceuticals and material sciences to skin health, which, you know, probably back in the day they did not have it all. So, this is unique to today's skincare time. And I think too, like if you look at today's market, there are so many different ways of categorizing the different types of products out there. You look at number one, prevention, right? That to me reminds me of protection against either environmental or biological stress. Most of these products revolve around sunscreen and antioxidants. So you think like, vitamin C or E, as well as barrier creams. Maintenance is another big category. So you think, the purpose of maintenance is to support, hydration and normal function. These are kind of, I think, typically what I, am using, just kind of lotions and moisturizers. And then there's treatment in terms of reversing or correcting a problem. Kind of the main products around treatment are around acne and anti-aging and hyperpigmentation. And then rescue, kind of soothing inflammation or damaged skin, which, is another big category. So I think it's unique how dermatologists today have categorized these four specific categories. And, we've talked a lot about the history and science behind skincare, but, we never asked or never answered how big is skincare actually, because this market is growing quite a bit.
Yeah, it's pretty big. So the global skincare market is around 122 billion, and it's expected to get to 194 billion by 2032. So that's a growth rate of around 6.8%. And of that 194 billion, 60% of that is face care. And then you've got body, sun care, special treatments making up the balance of that 40%. And that part is growing pretty consistently as well. The top markets for skincare are number one, China, at about $30 billion. And this is really fueled by luxury dermatology brands. There's a very tech savvy Gen Z in China that is driving a lot of the trends, a lot of the growth. The US is number two at 25 billion. It's a very mature, saturated market, but still strong. Lots of dermatologist-led and influencer-led brands are resonating there. And then Japan rounds out the top three at 12 billion. And this is just, Japan has a very long-standing beauty culture, a lot of focus on anti-aging and refinement. So those are the top three biggest ones. If I'm thinking from an investment point of view of where to maybe be and grow, there are four markets that pop up as like the fastest growing. India being one. You've got a growing middle class, lots of D2C explosion going on. Indonesia is number two, very youthful population, rapid digital adoption. Africa, particularly Nigeria and South Africa, they're underpenetrated, and there's a lot of local ingredient innovation that's happening. And D2C and e-commerce is starting to take root there as well. And then Brazil is interesting because they take a body first beauty approach. So whereas face care dominates in the US, body care, making sure that you're taking care of the whole skin and not just the 6 inches on your head, is a big piece of what Brazil does.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting to see how big the market is and just what areas are growing so much. And, there's a lot of these conglomerates that really dominate the market today, right? And a lot of them have rolled up some pretty major players. You've got L'Oreal Group that owns CeraVe and a few other brands. You've got Estee Lauder, another huge one, Dr. Jart Plus and DSIM. You've got Unilever that owns Dermalogical and Simple Paul's Choice. You've got P&G, Procter & Gamble, Olay, and Native they own. And you've got Shiseido that was the one that bought Drunk Elephant. I want to say they bought for, was it around $700 million, I'm pretty sure. That acquisition happened about 5 or 10 years ago. Johnson & Johnson, you've got Neutrogena and Clean and Clear. You just have these like really major conglomerates that have either, kind of come to be through one major brand that has just grown over time through mass distribution, or, these roll-ups that have kind of acquired more and more major players over time. But, typically I think these conglomerates have one or two major skincare brands that they own, and over time they've acquired more and more. So there's a lot of M&A going on in this market, and that's how these conglomerates really stay top of mind for consumers worldwide.
Oh, it is by far, I think, the hottest CPG M&A market out there. So if you want to build a company that's likely to get bought, do a halfway decent job with building a skincare brand. Deal volume is up 30% year over year, comparing 2023 to 2024. And the major buyers, you kind of fall into two groups. You've got strategics, so think L'Oreal, Estee Lauder, Unilever, P&G, and then private equity. So General Atlantic, Advent, Carlyle, and other family offices that are just entering the space. There have been a handful of deals. So Rhode, which was just announced they're acquired by Elf, will be profiling Rhode on the next episode. They were announced for $1 billion deal. L'Oreal acquired Medicate, another company that will be profiling for $1 billion in 2024. Galderma sold to L'Oreal for 1.85, and Church and Dwight acquired Hero Cosmetics for 630 million in 2022. And I'll just say, from a personal perspective, I've worked with a lot of these brands, both the acquirers and the acquired. And so this is a space that we know pretty well just because of how much growth and M&A deals happening there.
Yeah, and it's pretty amazing to see the amount of M&A that's happening in this category. I mean, there's not many categories where you have this many transactions happening over a short period of time, especially in this market. And so I think, for any founder out there, there is a lot of opportunity here. And what's interesting is that skincare is such a large and diverse category. And despite being big, the market isn't monolithic, right? There's a lot of different interesting trends or differences around the world and what markets prioritize. And I mean, I'm curious, was there any that stood out to you?
Yeah, this kind of gets into how the just the culture and the history is a little bit different. It's really interesting because the ingredients don't tend to differ from country to country, but the usage and the products that are popular do differ. And so these skincare philosophies are really personal and deeply rooted in culture. And so it kind of makes you wonder, could you really have a global skincare brand, or is it just inherently local? But just to walk into some of these differences. So Asia, this is a very ritualized, preventative, and gentle focus. Skincare is a daily routine. It's not a reactive fix. It emphasizes hydration and balance and long-term health. And there's a lot of focus on traditional ingredients, so fermented rice, green tea, ginseng, those things like that. And in terms of how Asia has helped move skincare forward for the rest of the world, they really introduced this idea of layering and gentle actives and kind of skin first beauty. Whereas you compare that with North America, this is all about results driven and marketing led. So the core values are speed, performance, problem solving. Skincare is often a reactive thing. So let me fix wrinkles, fight acne, brighten fast. I want this thing fixed. I want it fixed now. And there's a lot of derm science and things like that with bold claims that encourage you or promise that you'll kind of go back and look 20 years younger. And there's a lot of celebrity culture, influencer marketing, D2C innovation that pushes that. And so the benefit here for the global skincare market is that the North American market has really turned skincare into high growth, science meets aspiration. And it's just you look at even today in 2025, Asian skincare is still rooted in prevention and harmony, whereas North American skincare is all built around problem solving and urgency. And I guess a question for you, Nathan, is why do you think that Western consumers wait for a skin issue before they do something about it, whereas Eastern consumers maybe treat skincare like brushing their teeth?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think for me, what comes to mind is just that it's rooted in a culture dynamic in Asia, right? I remember when I lived in China, I remember getting up in the morning and my host mom would do her skincare routine religiously every single morning. And I mean, I think she literally did that same routine every single morning that I lived there for a whole year, and it was pretty remarkable to see, right? I mean, I think she had been doing it since she was a teenager. I think her mom had taught her. And it's just something that she has done religiously every single day of her life. And I think, in general, Western consumers, because these market dynamics and trends shift so quickly, that a lot of times we're trying new products, we're trying new trends, we're potentially exposed to a lot of different environments that we want to treat, at a more reactive manner. And I just don't know if it's really rooted as culturally as it is in Asia, as an example, or other parts of the world. So to me, that's what comes to mind. It's just that it was kind of a ritual that was almost passed down from her mother and kind of seemed to stem historically rather than more kind of marketing driven that we see happening in a lot of US based consumer markets here.
Yeah, it almost seems as if you're saying that it is hard to acquire a consumer in Asia, but once you do, as long as your product works, you're to keep them for life. Whereas it's probably easier to acquire a new customer in North America, but the repeatability is the hard part because people want, if they buy a bottle and they're not instantly healed or fixed, then maybe they're looking for something else.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, the LTV in Asia is probably, very long. And I think in America, from what I've seen, people are trying new products very often.
Yeah. Well, kind of continuing with this trend of differences, Europe has this minimalist or functional kind of focus. They want balance and regulation and gentle actives, and so especially in a place like France and Germany, skincare is very gentle. It's pharmaceutical pretty much. It's understated. I mean, my wife and I were just in Spain last month, and it's interesting. We went to a pharmacy and they have skincare products that couldn't be sold in the U.S. just in the pharmacy they could get because they're basically pharmaceuticals, and so that's really the focus that they have. And so they've made this pharmacy skincare really more of a cult status, and it's you come back to this again. It's like French and German consumers trust a lot fewer products. They want them to be more highly regulated. They want them to be backed by science, whereas Americans are often chasing more. And so it's kind of this question of, is skincare becoming overcomplicated because of freedom, or is it really a lack of trust? Like, would the US market be better off by having more regulation, having fewer things available? Or would Europe be better off by, maybe taking a page of the US handbook?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I just think of kind of the FDA here and how, a lot of, if you look at our food supply chain, for example, is, not allowed in Europe, right? And so it
Yeah.
kind of makes me wonder, does that translate over to skincare as well? I don't know. I don't have a clear answer to that, but that is what I think about in terms of, hey, are there certain things that we allow in our moisturizers or sunscreen that is not allowed in Europe? And that there's probably some things that we should translate over and vice versa. I mean, that's what comes to mind when I think about kind of the global skincare dynamic in terms of regulation. I just wonder, hey, like for example, the red dyes in America, right? They just
Yeah.
got banned, and a lot of major food producers are having to take those out of their products. And I wonder if that stems to skincare in the US versus in other parts of the world. I don't know, but I'm sure there's got to be differences in regulation like you're mentioning.
Well, I mean, I think European governments tend to care a lot more about what goes in people's body or on people's body. Whereas I think the US posture is people will be educated themselves and will make, the appropriate decision. So I think you kind of have that bit of a divide. But it's really difficult when there's so much social media or influencer driven stuff. It's hard for people to really be educated to really know. So we'll see. I think the takeaway here is that if you're a founder of a brand and you're thinking about getting into another market, just be aware that what worked in the US may not work in Asia. And there are different reasons for it. You're just gonna have to talk to that consumer, do things differently than as opposed to like a rinse and repeat.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because so many of these global brands, really ignore kind of the body and just focus on facial skincare, which I wonder why. Maybe it's because most people see your face first rather than, your hands or legs or whatever. So I guess that makes sense in some sense. People are probably most concerned by their face and their skincare routine on their face. But I think what is very unique across every country is the supply chain, right? And actual products and kind of building blocks of this industry. Because almost every skincare product, whether it be a serum, a moisturizer, or sunscreen, consists of three layers of ingredients: the base, the support, and active ingredients. Active ingredients equates for about 0.1 to 10% of the formula, but the majority of the cost, right? So what's crazy is that, basically 90% of what you're paying for is just the base.
Just
And
water.
Yeah, just water and about, probably less than 10% is the actual active ingredient. And so this is really to deliver the clinical or noticeable benefit of the skin. And the challenge with this is actually balancing the kind of irritation risk, especially for sensitive skin, right? You kind of wonder, okay, well, why don't I just buy the active ingredient and put it on my skin? It could really irritate your skin if it doesn't have a base. And so these examples of active ingredients could be something as simple as vitamin C. And so I think at the end of the day, what's so unique about skincare and the supply chain is that, there are really scientific based formulas to help, understand how to deliver these active ingredients in the best possible manner to your skin. And what comes to mind to me is, okay, you've got the base, which in general seems pretty, standard and relatively easy to source. But I wonder, how hard is it to source some of these active ingredients, and kind of, what stands out there around the sourcing with active ingredients? Because that is really the most important part of any skincare product.
Yeah, it's really different. Obviously, most places have water, and so you don't have to worry about that. But some of the actives, like retinoids or peptides or niacinamide, those sorts of things can vary widely. And so some have, global suppliers. It's very easy to get. Others, like high purity retinol or encapsulated peptides, these are biotech derived formulas that are subject to IP restrictions. Botanical extracts have seasonality. There's regional sourcing issues you have to have, and then SPFs are actually really heavily regulated and sometimes banned in specific markets. And so I know that the sunscreen coming out of Australia has to be a certain level, and I think is too strong to come into the U.S. or something like that. And so these high efficacy, low irritation actives, so think stabilized vitamin C, these are the most innovation and margin sensitive areas in sourcing. And so, like you said, it may be 0.1% of the total volume that's in there, but account for 80% of your cost and 100% of the impact of why someone would buy that product.
Yeah, and I wonder who actually makes these products, right? Is it pretty broad based, or is the supply chain very concentrated? Like, I remember in the athleisure season we did, most of those products are stemming from, Vietnam and China and other parts of Asia. I mean, is the supply chain here pretty concentrated?
It's deceptively complex, is how I put it. So while you may be holding a bottle of serum and saying, "Oh, like this is fine," really it depends on what you're making and where you're making it from. So there's a couple manufacturing clusters around the world to take a look at. South Korea being one. They're really known for innovation, pushing the envelope. So think K Beauty. They have really flexible MOQs. A lot of startups will start with something, and there's actually quite a few. I mean, look at Hero Cosmetics, was taking an Asian beauty trend, moving it to the US with a single product using a South Korean manufacturer. Of course, you can't talk about sourcing without talking about China. So there's a lot of bulk raw materials, tubes, pumps, things like that come out of Asia. Uh, they're starting to make some more inroads into formulation, but for all intents and purposes, they're mainly on the packaging. U.S., particularly California, New Jersey, and Texas, are really well known for these sorts of things. They've separated themselves in terms of really doing prestige, clean beauty manufacturing. A lot of FDA compliance and things that go into that. France and Germany, we talked about luxury formulations, pharmacy, things like those sorts of elements. And then India, botanicals, cosmeceutical formulations. And then, not to be outdone, don't forget about Canada. There's a lot of highly regulated natural products coming out of Canada. And so you kind of have these clusters in the East, the West, and Europe, each doing something that's slightly different. And so you can't necessarily just say, oh, well, I'm going to sell in Europe. Let me go find a European manufacturer. It may be that the only manufacturer that can make your product in the way that you want it is in New Jersey. And so that's why you look at these. And, I've been lucky enough to look behind the curtain at a lot of really well-known, multi-$100 million brands. And those supply chains are an absolute mess. And you try to look at it and say, well, why don't we have fewer factories? And like, well, this person does this comes from that. These don't work well with that. And so it's really interesting that way.
Yeah, and I think it's unique too because there's basically kind of two types of manufacturers, right? You have your typical contract manufacturing organization, and this is basically where you would go to them with the formula and they would produce it, right? But as we discussed, kind of a key with any skincare product is the formula, right? And so you either have to spend a lot of time and research and hire different formulators to understand, hey, what's the best formula for my product based on kind of the outcome you're looking to achieve, whether it be to hydrate your skin or exfoliate or whatever it may be. And then you actually have manufacturers that include the contract development. So they will help develop and formulate the product then manufacturer, and they oftentimes retain ownership of the formulation. And so I think this is very distinct, different types of manufacturers that you could partner with. I mean, in my opinion, I wouldn't want my factory to own the formula that I'm going to use. So, 9 times out of 10, I'm going to go with your typical CMO that's going to actually just manufacture the product. I'm going to spend the time to actually provide the formula to them. And so there are, I think, a lot more small to mid CMOs than you'd expect. Most of them operate under NDAs for multiple brands. And there's some larger players as well in the market that can white label and custom manufacture different products. So, I mean, very distinct types of manufacturing, but I would think in most cases, 99% of the brands are not going to want their factory to own their formula.
Yeah, and you can negotiate that way. It's just something to think about. I think a lot of people will get stuck by signing something they didn't read or didn't understand, and then that's where you end up with an IP issue. What does the packaging supply chain typically look like?
Yeah, I mean, packaging is so unique in skincare, right? Because that's really how you stand out on the shelf. And so it's completely different than, the actual skincare formula itself. Most skincare brands are almost always sourcing their packaging across borders with different components. So China definitely dominates the packaging when it comes to the skincare products. So, they do molds, glasses, airless pumps, and plastic. Italy and Germany, they're a leader in luxury glass and fragrance components, as well as metallized finishes.
Mhm.
And in the US and Canada, there are suppliers that still exist. They're obviously typically more expensive and slower unless there's stock packaging used. But I think really one of the major pain points when it comes to packaging for skincare is the MOQ requirements, right? If you're producing a new type of bottle or pump for your skincare brand, your MOQs could exceed 5,000 or 10,000 units per SKU, which is quite a bit for a startup brand. And oftentimes there's long lead times for packaging, talking 16 weeks or more for custom components. And obviously you have to do compatibility testing to ensure that the actual serum or moisturizer that you're putting in your packaging is going to come out effectively, right? I always kind of find it funny where you've got a shampoo bottle and you've got like the bottom half you can't get out, and you're like, who designed this? There should be another way to get this out. And so I think there's a lot of pain points and kind of interesting takes when it comes to packaging in this industry, because that's really how you stand out, and it's really how that person that's buying your product really first interacts with your brand, right? The first thing they see is going to be your packaging.
Yeah, you had mentioned that some of the products are essentially water, right, with some level of active ingredients. And so, how concentrated are these active ingredients? Are they really pure, or are even those really diluted before they go into the bottle?
Yeah, I mean, so typically they're pretty diluted. These are pretty strong compounds, though, in their own right. So, higher doesn't always mean better per se. The formulation, pH, and synergy matter more than the actual raw percentage. And so, this is where formulators are really important. If you're going to create a new skincare brand, probably one of the first things you should do is talk to a formulator to understand, what the balance should be. Some ingredients like vitamin C may take up 10 to 20% of the concentration, not because it's dangerous, but because it's not stable above 20%. Whereas, other ingredients like retinols may be 0.25 or 1%. But, at the end of the day, it really comes down to the formula and the stability of your formula. And so I think there's a lot to consider when designing a product in skincare, more than meets the eye, right? You're not just kind of, I mean, I guess you could potentially formulate it at home, right? But it would be really hard and probably a ton of trial and error. I think most of the time you're hiring or working with a formulator that has a lot of experience within the skincare industry. And so it seems like, I mean, I guess what comes to mind when there's challenges creating custom formulations?
Well, first and foremost, has to be the stability, right? So because of the ingredients that you're choosing, especially if you're trying to go the clean beauty route and more natural ingredients, just things like vitamin C or retinol really oxidize easily. And as you mentioned, the packaging can have a big impact on pH control or just the efficacy of the product. So stability is number one. I think compatibility is another issue you have to worry about. So there are some ingredients that just don't play well together. And so, if you have something with a low pH and something with a neutral pH, that can really mess things up. Um, Next you've got like the sensory experience. So people want it to smell good, they want it to feel good. Of course, you've got cost and sourcing, you've got testing, and then obviously the regulatory stuff you have to worry about. So claims like anti-aging or acne treatment, those are regulated as drugs in the U.S. And ingredient bans or limits are different across countries. And so what you can sell in the U.S. you can't sell in the EU or China, and vice versa. And so you really have to think through those and be specific about the market you're entering.
Yeah, I mean, and one thing that we didn't really touch on yet that is pretty crazy is that regulatory issues arrive across every country and category, and there's different frameworks that should be top of mind for any founder that's looking at producing their own skincare product. Is that right?
Yeah, so in 1938 is where we have the first division. That was the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which really defined the difference. They said that drugs are here to treat and cosmetics are here to decorate. And skincare kind of falls in between both categories. So, in today's kind of modern interpretation, cosmetic is for color, skincare is for health and function. And really, anybody that claims to treat something, the more that item is going to be considered a drug and regulated accordingly. And so any claim that you make has to be truthful. You can't mislead or substantiate. There is no fake news, in skincare necessarily. If you say clinically proven, you need to have clinical testing. And so there are some allowed claims where skincare will fall more on the cosmetic side. If you say it hydrates the skin or it improves the appearance of fine lines, that's considered more of a cosmetic thing. So you don't have to have as rigorous of testing or claims behind it. Whereas if you make drug-like claims, such as boost collagen production or repairs skin barrier at the cellular level, that's where the FDA will say, hey, you've got to back these up. And so even today in clean beauty, a lot of the clean claims are coming under scrutiny, and the FTC is starting to target people about greenwashing and say, hey, are these really better? How do you know this? And you go through that. I think the interesting thing about North America and the US in particular is that most enforcement in skincare comes from lawsuits, not the FDA. And so it's usually a retailer compliance team or adverse consumer publicity. You think about an influencer brand that pushes back and says these sorts of things. But a few years ago in 2023, there was a new law, MOCRA, which now requires every skincare brand to be registered with the FDA, to have adverse event reporting in place, and just to make sure that their factories can sign a GMP or good manufacturing practice compliance. And that's actually starting enforcement in July of 2025.
Yeah, it's starting next month. I mean, that's something that any skincare brand should keep top of mind because GMP certification is vital now for any skincare brand. And I think what's unique too is there's definitely differences in regulatory postures between countries. In America, obviously, we have the FDA and FTC that really keep an eye on different claims that these brands are making. A lot of people would say they're relatively lenient. In the EU and Canada, they have much tighter pre-market compliance, and they've been actually 1,600 ingredients versus only 11 in the US. So kind of goes back a little bit to what I was saying around, red dyes and the FDA and just, how much is banned in the EU and Canada versus in the US. And one thing that I thought was unique that I wasn't quite sure why it changed, but up until 2021, China required animal testing on these products. In Australia, actually, one thing unique that I saw in that market is that they regulate sunscreen as a therapeutic good, and so a lot of regulation to look out for worldwide. If I'm a founder listening to this episode, I guess what do you think is top of mind that I should think of in terms of the commercialization process?
Yeah, I think if you're thinking about, okay, I have this idea, how quickly can I launch? There's a couple of steps you have to go through. The first one is we'd always recommend you have a brief. So who's your target consumer? What concern do they have about their skin? What texture you're looking for? What price point do you want, etc. From there, you need to find an R&D lab. You're going to start to do lots of iterations between different bases and actives. Again, dialing in the right percentage. Again, not to give away too much from next week, but Hailey Bieber, when she was working on Rhode, spent 2 years going through and just finding that right formulation for their products. After you have a formulation that you think works, You're typically spending about 3 to 6 months doing stability testing. And then you get to go from your scale up. And can be a really hard thing to do because you're going to go from a lab batch, which is 100 milliliters, up to a pilot batch, which could be 100 kilograms. And so, as anybody who's worked in manufacturing knows, it is not a guarantee to go from a bench test up to mass production. Once you're able to prove that you can make it at scale, then you have to go and do more testing, this time around packaging compatibility. You've got to go through and take a look at how you're going to substantiate your claims. And then you finally are able to get ready for your launch. And that's where you start to think about labeling, regulatory filings, actual production. But all in all, if you're looking to kind of go from cold start to launch, the fastest you could probably do this is in about 9 months.
Yeah, I mean, it's an extensive timeline, but it's very important. I think, especially, making sure from a regulatory standpoint, you're compliant. Like you said, going from a bench test to full production is always complex and tricky. And there's always stuff that comes up when you're trying to scale up like that, and even get your first products to market. You know, I think we talked a bit about it, but how common is white label here versus, really unique IP?
It's very common. I think roughly about 70% of new brands, according to our research, are white label. And these are typically short term testing brands. The reason they're so popular is there's a very low barrier to entry. It's very fast to go to market. And typically, you're going to be an influencer led brand that's doing testing for product market fit. Maybe you're an Amazon first skincare line or just drop shipping. The downside with this is there's no IP. There's no moat. It's really easy to copy, and it can be difficult to get into retail. So you're probably just selling on Amazon, and that's about it. The more common piece is about 20 to 25% will be a custom formulation. This is where they'll partner with a contract manufacturer, typically 6 to 12 months, but allows you to have ingredient claims, clinical testing, some IP. And you usually see this happening with venture-backed companies, tech-led skincare, brands aiming for M&A because they need to have that one thing that's different. And then I guess the tail end would be about 5%, which are IP driven or biotech derivatives. And these are really around novel active ingredients or a delivery mechanism. And it requires a lot of R&D, a lot of clinical data. Usually these come out of university labs or partnership with researchers, but VCs absolutely love these because it's a moat and it's defensibility. And, you think about Mother Science, Eighth Day, those sorts of companies are the ones that have really made a moat because of how they made their formulation.
Yeah, VCs are placing quite a few bets in this category, partially because there's real active M&A activity. This category is growing like crazy. I mean, what were kind of some major takeaways that you had from our category kickoff here?
Man, I tell you, I think I had a casual usage of or understanding of skincare, and I feel like I've gone so much deeper in understanding not only how to use skincare myself, but really just what the supply chain, the market, the differences are. And so for me, the biggest takeaway was that skincare is not just about skin; it's really a reflection of the culture, the values, the identity of the user of that market. And I think that's been an interesting thread that I'm looking forward to see throughout the season.
Yeah, no, I mean, this was a great category kickoff. I think skincare has so much opportunity in it. I'm really excited to dive into some of the major players in it and the M&A activity that's happened. I put our notes into ChatGPT and I said, summarize this in one very smooth, cool line. And this is what it came up with. It said, from temples to TikTok, skincare has been shaped and shaped by the way we live. And for today's brands, that's both an opportunity and a responsibility. So definitely a lot of opportunity here, a lot of responsibility as well. And really, really enjoyed this category kickoff on e-commerce on tap, brought to you by Source Finance. But if you haven't already, you need to leave a review and like and subscribe. So we appreciate you tuning in to this episode of e-commerce on tap. And next episode, we're going to dive into one of the major brands that just had a massive exit. So excited to see you then.